Welcome to the Mayor Brown's BTS webinar series. My name is James. I'll be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please note that this conference is being recorded. I will now turn the call over to Jamie Concius. Ms. Concius, you may begin.
Thank you, operator. My name is Jamie Concius, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. We have introduced this webinar series to provide you with timely briefings on key topics when you work on business and technology sourcing transactions. Our goal is to provide practical and strategic advice to help you in entering into, governing, renegotiating, or exiting those transactions. Today's program, the fourth in our series, is titled Negotiating ERP Implementation Agreements for Success. Topics in our series have included NSA data collection and its impact on cloud and outsourcing, technology dispute resolution, aligning incentives through contract terms, and financial institutions in contracting for cloud. To listen to any of these programs, please visit the BTS and Technology Sourcing Events page on mayorbrown.com. A couple of administrative matters, and then we'll get started. During today's presentation, you will be provided with an alphanumeric code. If you are applying for CLE credit, you will need to record this code on the virtual sign-in sheet that you received by email with the connection details. You will find directions for returning that virtual sign-in sheet on that form. We will read the code in the middle of the presentation and then again at the end. We plan to include time at the end of the program for questions. To submit a question electronically, please use the Q&A panel in WebEx. If we do not get to your question during this webinar, we will make every attempt to follow up with you after this program. This program is being recorded as we normally do with these webinars. In a day or so, we will be sending you an email with a link which you can use to listen to the webinar again or share with your colleagues. The recording will also be posted to our website. I am pleased now to introduce today's speakers, Paul Roy and Paul Chandler. Paul Roy is a partner in the Business and Technology Sourcing practice in Chicago and represents clients in a broad range of information technology and business process transactions, including technology development, implementation, support, and outsourcing transactions. He regularly advises clients with the outsourcing of IT infrastructure services and support, application development and maintenance, network management, and support and help desk call center services. Paul also advises clients on the sourcing of finance and accounting functions, HR employee services, CRM, and financial services operations, among other business process functions. Paul Chandler is counsel in Mayor Brown's Business and Technology Sourcing practice in Chicago. He represents clients in connection with the outsourcing of information technology functions and business processes. In addition, Paul assists clients that are working to develop, license, market, distribute, and acquire rights in a wide variety of technology-related products, services, and intellectual property, including computer software and hardware, open source software, databases, cloud services, and telecommunication systems. He also represents clients interested in forming technology joint ventures and other strategic alliances. I will now pass the presentation to Paul Chandler. Paul, you may begin.
Thank you, Jamie. Our goal in this presentation is to look at the reasons ERP implementation projects fail and what we can learn from that in the contracting process to help promote success. Here are the topics we'll be covering. First, we'll discuss examples and the potential impact of failures, as well as statistics on how frequently ERP projects fail. Second, we'll discuss the most common reasons for this failure. Third, we'll discuss what you can do as a lawyer involved in the ERP project to promote success or at least minimize the risk of failure, both in terms of recommended contract protections and appropriate counseling of your business clients. And finally, we'll finish with some of our key takeaways. Now, Paul Roy will talk about some of the failures and successes we're seeing.
From reading the literature on ERP systems, and their implementation, you get the clear sense that successful implementation projects are in the small minority. In fact, various surveys, including several academic studies, have found very low rates of success for ERP implementation projects. Now, they vary in their conclusions. Some studies have found successes range in the range of 10 to 40%, and an academic study and another study that used a fairly strict standard of measuring success to on time, on budget, found the rate of success being between 6 and 7%. I think we'd all agree that that's a fairly strict definition. But a much more extensive academic study that actually referenced other similar academic studies that were fairly exhaustive and detailed in their methodology found that about 70% of the projects did not achieve their estimated benefits, and that 40 to 60% can be classified as failures. Now, which of these statistics is accurate depends a great deal on how you define success. But however you define success, the message is clear. Given the rate of implementation failures, companies that embark on these projects should take special care to learn from the mistakes of others. Next slide, please. Now, I talked about the failure rate being high, but it's important to keep in mind that the consequences are high as well. Because ERP systems typically involve a broad range of enterprise functions, problems have broad effects on a company. They can affect things as basic as the ability to ship product, and very commonly impair the ability of a company to track their financial process and even to invoice for things. The result can be things like lost sales, drop in stock price, and shareholder suits. Now, the cost of these projects is very large, so the cost of abandoning projects can be high. In the case of, there are a few publicly noted examples, and for reasons I'll talk about later, many cases are not public. In the case of Avon, their abandoned project was estimated to have cost them about $135 million to the point of abandonment. And the overall cost of improperly implemented systems that do proceed can be at least as high, if not higher, when you consider the overall cost, meaning the direct and indirect costs. Now, both Hershey and Nike, well-known examples, each reported about $100 million in lost sales. Hershey's interruption occurred on the run-up to the all-important Halloween holiday, and they both experienced significant drops in stock price due to problems with their new ERP systems. And of course, as you always know, whenever there's drops in stock price, that often attracts litigation. Now, companies are not anxious to report their problems, so unless a problem arises to the level of an SEC disclosure or results in a public litigation, many problems are not publicly reported. Just as a note, by the way, a lot of these problems from unsuccessful implementations involve consequential damage, the very kinds of things that are typically excluded in any contract for services. The lesson from these failures is not that ERP projects should be avoided, as they have tremendous benefits for companies, as Paul Chandler will discuss next, but rather the lesson is that companies would be well advised to invest in the time, effort, and resources up front to help ensure success of their project, given the very high cost and potential adverse effects of failure. Now, let's look at what makes ERP projects different.
Before we talk about the reasons for failure in ERP projects, we need to level set on some general ERP background because not everyone may be familiar with these items. And in particular, what makes ERP different from other software implementation projects a company may undertake? In a nutshell, it's the sheer scale and scope of change, including, most importantly, change in the company's business processes. Consider these features as shown on the slide. These projects have ambitious enterprise-wide goals. They offer the potential to revolutionize the way the company operates. For example, by enabling lean business processes to improve competitiveness, speed, and efficiency. They often have the goal of setting up an information superhighway to give company management real-time access to data from around the enterprise and powerful analytics to digest that data. They are enormously complex at a detail level. And when I say detail level, I mean down to the data field in each affected system. In order to harness these potential benefits, the new systems must touch and integrate with many functional areas within the company at a detail level. This is everything from HR, treasury, logistics, to time clocks. Of course, The specifics depend on what's being implemented. This means that you'll be connecting departments, processes, and systems in new ways, things that may have been isolated and separate systems in the past, and this creates substantial interdependencies. For example, consider the business process for ordering a product, which may involve, in an ERP project, analyzing and deciding on technical and business requirements from IT, finance, warehousing, logistics, supply chain, and other functions. Likewise, something as seemingly simple as a change in how parts numbers are formatted within your company may have downstream impacts to how historical data is stored, as well as impacts on customer and vendor ERP systems that the company must communicate with. Dealing with these complexities requires gathering and reviewing the perspectives of different groups from around the company. In the end, success requires a joint effort between the company's business experts and the consultant's deep technical knowledge of the software and ERP experience. Beyond this complexity, these projects require business process transformation. It's best to think of ERP implementation projects as more like a business project than the implementation of new technology. To implement the new system, each of the company's current business processes needs to be mapped to the out-of-the-box capabilities of the new system so that a business decision can be made about how to deal with the process gaps and what the future state business processes will be. In essence, you must decide what to change, your current processes or the out-of-the-box functionality of the new system. And you can imagine the scale of this transformation effort. This process review will need to be done for every single in-scope process, and a typical company may have hundreds of these processes. And each of these reviews must include your business experts from the impacted functional areas of the company. Finally, and I know this is fairly obvious, even though this effort can be very demanding, the work must be done while the company continues to operate normally without an impact. Another important thing is to keep in mind that the process of implementing ERP is like a funnel, as Paul Roy will discuss later, where you move from high-level requirements and deliverables to more and more detailed ones. And this makes it very difficult and expensive to correct earlier errors as the project moves on. And also, even if the company decides that it will not make customizations to the new system, we often have clients that talk about accepting out-of-the-box functionality, as if that would simplify the complexities of the project. Well, it may in one sense, but you still need to train all of the personnel of the company on new processes, in effect, how they're going to be doing business. And finally, ERP projects offer the promise of cost savings if legacy systems can be retired. But keep in mind, in practice, doing this can be very difficult if the legacy systems include stranded functionality that the company still needs, or the company's personnel are slow to embrace the new system. Next slide, please. So with that background, let's now look at why ERP projects fail. Of course, there are many reasons, but I think they can all be boiled down to the following most common underlying factors. First, lack of a clear understanding of what the company wants to achieve. Company management may have a general sense of the potential benefits of implementing ERP. Everybody's heard of ERP and the potential benefits. But project failures can occur when the company does not define a clear, objective set of strategic goals that can be translated into specific IT requirements. For example, it's things like the company would want a 10% increase in specified customer SLAs, or the company needs the ability to quickly integrate the business of a newly acquired entity, or the ability to overcome the legacy system limitations it deals with today. If the only project goals are generic ones or refer to implementing best practices, the project team may have trouble deciding what level of integration is required, what legacy system should be retired, or what specific business processes are critical to achieving success. As the saying goes, if you don't know where you're going, you don't know when you arrive there. The second factor is lack of a detailed and feasible plan for achieving success. Many of the other failures that we'll discuss stem from a failure of the project team to have and follow a detailed plan to set clear requirements and approaches for what is to come. As we'll discuss later, such a plan would include things like phased review of the company's current IT environment on overall business requirements to identify gaps in the new system, and very importantly, staffing and timing commitments for both the consultant and the company's resources. And this leads directly to the next failure factor, lack of understanding the effort required of the company. As noted earlier, without a detailed plan, it's hard for the project team to keep focused on what's required and how to proceed. But also, without such a plan, it's difficult for you to appreciate just how much work your company will need to do to implement the new system and to line up the required people to participate in the project at the right times with the right skills and take care of backfill so that normal business can continue. This often results in project delays, overwork, and the loss of key people with core knowledge. Here's some additional failure factors. Inefficient or inexperienced consultants. This can result in poor work quality, wasted time, and the consultant missing the opportunities to spot, escalate, and resolve problems before their impact is magnified. Insufficient training. Bad training can make it difficult for users to understand the new system, and that increases their resistance to adopting the new system. This also leads potentially to our next failure factor, unplanned customizations. That we're talking about things like reports, interfaces, forms, and enhancements for the new system, which can be very expensive if not planned in the budget. This generally signals that the system is not a good fit for your company's business processes, and it's another result of poor project preparation. Sometimes this happens when the company fails to validate the software vendor's claims made during the sales process that the software will work, quote, out of the box without customizations. As noted above, this can also result from insufficient training or a cultural resistance to change within the company. Insufficient testing often leads to quality problems, and it can mask problems in training and places where the company's business requirements are not met. Insufficient testing is often the result of pressure to speed up the project or concerns over budget overruns. And finally, inadequate project management. This can happen when the project manager is inexperienced or lacks the political skills and savvy to resolve differences between the competing interests within the company, or lacks the ability to make careful and well-reasoned decisions, keeping the overall goals of the project in mind. Now let's look at how the contract can promote success.
Now, we saw the seriousness of the risks and the underlying causes that Paul Chandler talked about. In the remainder of this discussion, what we want to talk about is how you can structure your contract to help make your ERP project successful. Now, first of all, we want to recognize that there are a lot of factors outside of the lawyer's control, outside of the contract control, that determine success. But the contract can serve as a valuable guide for the structure and discipline that are necessary for success. There are three key principles that underlie our more detailed recommendations. First, it's clarity. This is important when you define key project details, including deliverables, milestones, acceptance criteria, the allocation of responsibilities between the parties. Second is incentives, a very key aspect of these contracts. You have to use a deal structure that fits the project and creates incentive for the consultant to achieve the company's desired outcome. As we'll talk more later, you also have to match the structure to the capabilities of the customer and the particular circumstance. Third, you have to have processes for interactions. You have to document processes for how the parties will work together. This inevitably involves a great deal of close working relationship between the consultant and the company. These include processes for deliverable acceptance, change management, governance, obtaining required approvals. And appropriate processes provide the early warning of problems before the impact mushrooms and causes much greater damage. Next slide, please. Now, ultimately, this is a business project, as Paul Chandler said, that includes a significant IT component, rather than an IT project that happens to have business consequences. The customer adheres and adapts the new ERP system by transforming its business processes and its business functions. Now, obviously, projects can vary. Some may simply be complex IT projects, but far more often, the projects have a primary business purpose. That means that IT is the means, not the driver of these projects. For your contract, that means you should be including the strategic goals, as Paul said, strategy, and the high-level plans that will serve as the basis of your project. Next slide, please. The contract also should clearly track the work stages with the appropriate decisions and approvals and adjustments that drive the details of the following stages. Now, while every technology platform and every consultant methodology will have their own processes and stages and names for them, we found that implementations typically follow the same broad set of stages. And as a lawyer, you need to understand this because it impacts how the contract memorializes the project. So, for example, in this terminology, you start with the design or blueprinting phase. This is the phase where you identify the user requirements. You compare the capabilities of the package against the existing functions and processes of the company. You identify gaps. Once you've done this and identified the target of where you're moving to, you've created the blueprint, you then move to the development, realization, the testing, rollout, go live, and after the go live, the support and maintenance. Now, these sound simple, but these can actually be broken down for various phases of the project or various geographies and can occur in this sequence at multiple times during an implementation. As Paul said, the stages operate as a funnel. You're moving from the higher level business requirements to the increasingly specific detailed steps to implement those requirements. So decisions at one step determine what you have to do at the next one, and every stage depends on the one before. Changing decisions is increasingly expensive as you move down this waterfall, and a concept like deemed acceptance can create genuine problems where the parties genuinely have not, or the customer has genuinely not approved a particular phase, and it moves to the next, creating substantial problems. Now, one of the risks we talked about is moving too quickly to implementation and skipping a lot of the detail that's necessary. There is a natural tendency among business teams to drive quickly to completion. As transactional lawyers, we routinely see this. However, this tendency can be particularly problematic given the complexity and the unique nature of these ERP implementation projects. The business team, the other part of it is the business team wants to get it done, and of course, the idea is that the document goes in the drawer and fails to achieve its essential purpose. Now, the tension is the act of actually getting it done sacrifices clarity and limits the customer's options and the leverage. And frankly, every consultant understands this. The economic term for this may be vendor lock-in. The very act of moving forward progress, absent a committed scope and price, actually is the catalyst for lack of clarity of scope, stages, and responsibility, as well as a collapse of leverage in the long haul. So what do we recommend? Well, first of all, design a statement of work as a project plan with legally binding commitments so that it's a part of the planning phase. Now, I know a lot of tendency among project teams is to think of project plans as outside of the contract, and that is true at a very detailed level. But the contract has to include the basic elements of the project plan, the primary milestones, and allocation of responsibility and deliverables. I think the best strategy here is to start with a robust template to minimize the time requirement and involve people who have experience in ERP projects. Now, this may require that you sell the benefits of these rigorous commitments and high-value contracting to your management because senior management endorsement is going to be very critical to success in these projects, particularly given the investment and time and potential upfront investment before you, quote, get it started. Next slide, please. The natural tendencies of each party left unchecked will expand the scope. Users prefer more functionality naturally and customization so that they don't have to adapt to the system, but rather have the system adapt to their past practices and their existing processes. And consultants have no reason to resist this because they will profit more. They have larger scale projects for doing this. The outcome, however, can be deviating from the very basis upon which the project was approved, which is to gain efficiencies and take advantage of the capabilities of an existing system. Partnership isn't sufficient here. The interests aren't really aligned. So how can you contract to help address these kinds of risks? Well, first of all, start with a contract that includes major scope parameters. The customer has to have control over what's implemented, and a budget should be set earlier that doesn't change unless there is a major scope parameter change. That imposes a certain discipline, frankly, on both sides. On the customer side, because it allows the project management to resist change, but also allows them to sort of stay within their original budget objectives. And I think in order to align the incentives, a very useful tool is really to offer to the service provider, the consultant, bonuses for early and under budget performance, and conversely, holdbacks and credits and rate reductions, or some combinations of that for late or over budget performance. Now that is a bit of a preview to some of the contract structure issues we'll talk about later, but these are some of the basic contract strategies that you can use. Now let's talk about complexity as a risk.
As I mentioned earlier, one of the key contributing factors to ERP project failures is their complexity. For example, the stages have interdependencies, there are common elements. The project requires the perspectives from user groups and different functional areas from around the company, and success requires the joint effort of the company and the consultants. So how do we deal with this complexity? Well, the best way to deal with the complexity is to break it down in the contract into its component parts. That means the work will be broken down, as Paul Roy mentioned, into phases, waves, or modules, with each one treated like its own separate project. For instance, this modularization will provide for solution descriptions, descriptions of activities, deliverables, responsibilities, staffing, and pricing for each of these breakdowns, each of these phases. And with this modularization strategy in mind, let's now talk about the project plan. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that a key failure factor is not having a detailed and feasible project plan. Let's look at what this should include. This plan should include. The plan should define by phase the purpose and scope of the phase, the activities to be performed, staffing, as we mentioned earlier, as well as interim and final deliverables, milestones, and acceptance criteria. And think for a moment about the failure factors we talked about. Having detailed staffing requirements will give the company a clear picture of the effort that will be required of it, as well as how many and at what times their internal resources will be needed to make decisions, test, or train. And the key here is feasibility. A rational schedule should provide adequate time for review, testing, and training, and this helps avoid quality problems. Speed should never come at the expense of quality. Of course, the less work you've done up front to prepare for the project and review current processes, gaps, and decide what the future state will look like, the more difficult it will be to create a detailed plan at the start of the project. But you should still be able to develop a detailed starting point with the elements that I've just described that can be refined as the work continues. The project plan is part of the contract. This is another very important point. It's not just a business document. so it should tie to the contract using defined terms and milestone dates from the contract. And the other key point here is that a significant part of the value of the plan is the learning that goes on in developing the plan. Both parties learn. When you start working on the plan, you quickly realize what is not well understood. For instance, contentious milestone discussions are often a signal that the parties have not clearly defined the project's goals and scope. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about allocation of responsibilities. A lot of problems in ERP projects, including delays and unexpected costs, arise from incomplete or unclear allocation of responsibilities between the parties. Provide clarity as to who does what, as well as who provides what. Without this clarity, there's a greater chance of finger pointing as to which party is responsible when something goes wrong. It's often helpful to designate responsibility by referring to which party is responsible, collaborating, or informed for a particular task or activity, and each of these terms would be defined in the contract. However, joint responsibility should be avoided, since that may mean that neither party is responsible if the activity is not performed. And just like the project plan, the responsibility allocation is part of the contract, and so you should use defined terms and avoid jargon. Finally, assumptions in the allocation of responsibilities matrix, or anywhere else in the contract for that matter, can create confusion if they're not accompanied by clear outcomes if the assumption turns out not to be valid. So for instance, if there is a scope constraint, like the consultant will develop no more than 5 reports, there should be a change control process and default pricing to address what happens if that constraint is exceeded. One more point to note. As we've been talking about allocation of responsibilities, you should keep in mind that it won't always be the case that the consultant does and provides everything for the project. For instance, the company will be responsible for making business decisions and signing off on deliverables. Likewise, the company may choose to use internal resources to cleanse and convert historical data for the new system, or it may decide to use its own IT environment for development work to be performed. In these cases, clearly allocating responsibility to the company for these items enables the consultant to leave that effort out of its pricing proposal. Next slide, please. This is what a responsibility allocation matrix may look like. There's no magic to the form of this. You should note, however, that in this example, the activity column on the left would be further defined in the contract. This keeps the chart clean and avoids any tendencies of the drafters to take shortcuts in descriptions to fit all the words in the cells. Those shortcuts often lead to disputes after signing. Next slide, please. Another important concept for ERP projects is that of acceptance. It is critical to have good acceptance provisions, as this determines really when one activity or phase ends and the next begins. Companies often get into trouble by not having a formal process. As noted earlier, shortcuts in reviews can lead problems to be discovered in later phases, which can be disastrous. You should think of acceptance in 2 key parts: criteria and process. Acceptance criteria set the standard for when acceptance should occur. These standards can range from things like it's done when it's sent for simple task or item to in company's sole discretion for design documents that are key. The main points here are that the acceptance criteria should be specified as appropriate for each deliverable. And it's very important to get this right because criteria for later phases are often developed as deliverables earlier in the project. Next, let's talk about the acceptance process and procedures. Conformity to acceptance criteria is a key element of a process, as well as sufficient time for your company to conduct review of the deliverable, and there should be an obligation for the consultant to correct errors. Deemed acceptance should be avoided, as Paul Roy mentioned earlier, since the potential harm of inadvertent acceptance is so high potentially in ERP projects. acceptance should be an affirmative step. And you should also have a system-level acceptance, which would be a roll-up of all the other deliverables in the project. Now let's discuss the deal structures that you can use for your project.
As you turn to constructing your contract, I think there are three basic structures you can use. One is the assist, the other is the deliver, and the third is the shared risk. Now, the extent to which you as a customer are prepared for the ERP, undertaking the ERP project, to the extent you understand your capabilities, to the extent you have resources, all of this will guide you as to which deal structure is possible. Just a brief preview, the assist structure may be a good fit, for example, when a company has internal resources and ERP experience to manage the project itself. The deliver structure is best when a company is well prepared for a project. It's analyzed its current business processes, gaps, has an understanding and requires the future, what it requires for future processes, and has a clearly defined project plan. And the shared risk structure can be used either when the company is prepared, as it is for the deliver structure, or when it has some but not all of the project preparation work done, but the parties are still able to articulate major scope parameters. Now, even if all these structures are possible, each has its own pros and cons. Next slide, please. Let's first look at the assist structure. In the assist structure, the consultant works at the company's direction and is paid on a time and materials basis. Now, it has a number of advantages and benefits to this. It allows the company to start very quickly and make changes at its discretion. It completely controls the project. However, the company bears the entire risk of overruns and late delivery. Now, this, as I said, may work well for companies that have completed all the detailed preparation work or are just looking for additional resources, smart hands, if you will, to help them. It is not well suited for companies that are heavily dependent on scoping, guidance, the expertise of consultants, where the consultant is providing the bulk of the experienced resources. Next slide, please. In the deliver structure, the consultant commits to work on a specified schedule for a specified fee. Now, this certainly encourages the consultant to do the work efficiently and quickly, perhaps using the lowest cost resources, and the consultant's fixed fee is dependent upon the detailed scope parameters that can be, as Paul said, maybe phrased as assumptions. However, if the contract fails to clearly and completely define the company's desired outcomes at a fairly detailed level, the company may be hit with an enormous number of change orders that increase costs and result in delayed competition. In other words, the company just wasn't prepared and didn't have a full understanding of what it was needed to undertake. In some cases, the consultant's willingness to even commit to a fixed fee will depend on the company being prepared. So even consultants may resist this in many instances. And the risks are heightened by the simple fact that the consultant's financial incentives at the start of the project may be to understate the scope or price to win the deal, or perhaps, to say it differently, not to correct the company's misapprehension as to what it's undertaking. Next slide, please. Let's look now at the shared risk structure. This structure is designed to reduce the overall risk by aligning the incentives and creating a spirit of partnership without completely allocating risk and responsibility to either party, but certainly allocating important responsibility to each party and some incentives. Now, how is this done? You accomplish this, first in this structure, you establish a target budget with shared risks and reward if the consultant exceeds or stays within a budget. It's not necessarily a hard and fast budget in that the consultant takes all the risk above it and gets takes all of the reward below it. For instance, the consultant's hourly rate may be progressively discounted or increased based on whether it's above or below the budget. However, like the deliver structure, the shared risk does require the parties carefully define at least the major desired outcomes. The structure does require more sophisticated contract to address how the change in scope or timing will impact the budget or incentives. There's a great deal of pressure on project management in these instances. It requires consideration of what changes are and are not chargeable. Now, I've just spoken about all these three structures, the assist, the deliver, and the shared risk, as if they're separate structures. But in reality, what we often find is that customers can use combinations of these structures within a project, either for, say, for example, different phases or components of the project. For example, you may need a consultant to help you on an assist basis in a particular activity, such as analyzing the current scope, where it's hard to know in advance what the scope of that would be. But expect a fixed fee or shared risk for later phases or later tasks. Now let's look at some of the processes that we've talked about.
Given the complexities with ERP projects that we've discussed, it's essential that you have clear and complete governance and change control processes so that the parties can work together successfully. And this is especially the case where the project uses fixed fee or shared risk structures that Paul Roy just described. The natural tension for the customer's functions to resist change and require more customizations, and the consultant's natural desire to claim scope change requires careful and well-informed judgments at each step to avoid scope creep and budget overruns. Good governance is also essential to ensure that each party is performing its responsibilities and to timely address problems when they arise and before they can cause ripple effects on the project. Think of governance as each party's best early warning system for project problems. Good governance requires skilled and experienced representatives from both the customer and the consultant to closely work together on a regular and frequent basis. And when we say regular and frequent, we mean not only monthly, weekly, but in many cases, daily meetings during the project to make sure things are on track. Depending on the particular project, there may be separate subcommittees in the governance chart from each separate functional area of the company that operate under a high-level, executive-level committee. This allows for prompt action by the best people to address a problem when it arises. Of course, this cannot happen without strong executive commitments from both parties to ensure that the resources necessary for governance are made available, and reprioritizing, if needed, normal work activities so that these people can focus on resolving governance issues. This also requires strong technical change control and efficient dispute resolution mechanisms so that disputes don't fester. Next slide, please. What other ways can we use to mitigate risk in the contract? Well, we mentioned earlier that ineffective or inexperienced consultants can be a contributing factor in failures. Paul Roy mentioned also that depending on the structure of the project, there may be an incentive for the consultant to use its lowest cost, least experienced resources. Personnel provisions in the contract are key to mitigating these risks. For example, by setting minimum qualifications and ERP experience levels for consultant resources. And by the way, this should also be a factor in how the company selects its own resources to participate in the project. Quality is key. Key personnel provisions so that resources that are particularly important to the project are not transferred to different projects and cause discontinuities and interruptions in the projects rather. You should have the right to see resumes and interview candidates from the consultant before they become part of the project. And finally, a right to remove consultants that are not a good fit for your project. Next slide, please. Finally, let's discuss your important role as a lawyer, both pre and post signing on the projects. During the negotiation process, you need to make sure that the business people understand the failure factors that we've discussed and how the contract is structured to address these factors. Many of these factors and approaches may seem apparent to you as we discuss them today, but they may not be apparent to people who have not been through ERP implementations in the past. And when you finish the contract, the lawyer's work is not done. keep in mind this is going to be a complex contract, and not everybody on the project team will be involved in the negotiation of it. So you need to help train the business people on the key terms and processes in the contract, and this will involve condensing the contract into a summary of key points, as most of the people on the project will not have the time or the energy to read the entire contract. Next, it's important to check in periodically to monitor progress and to help document changes to ensure that what the parties negotiated is what's being followed and that changes are clearly defined. This will also aid in resolving disputes should they occur. And finally, make sure that you as a lawyer are involved in changes or disputes to share your knowledge of the project and contract and to improve overall efficiency. Now let's consider some takeaway observations.
Well, we've talked about ERP projects as having very important, compelling benefits for companies, but that the failure rates are very high and the consequences of those failures can be very high as well. So there's a lot at stake. And we know that these are enormously complex undertakings, far in excess of typical IT projects. And as a result, there's a tendency of companies, perhaps companies with lots of experience with IT projects, to underestimate what's required in these projects. The way to approach these then is to have careful, detailed planning to minimize those risks. Use deal structures that align incentives on quality, cost, and duration to position the project for success. The contract has a very important role as a guide, as a promotion for the company's organization to really undertake all of these efforts very clearly. It can really essentially represent the important steps and details we've talked about. Well, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Now we'll turn to see if we have any questions. Jamie?
Thank you, Paul. We do have a question that has come through. It is, what can companies include in change control procedures to minimize disputes over change orders?
This is Paul Chandler. I'll try to answer that question. I think the best approach is to have a change control process that includes some key elements. For example, there should be a requirement that the consultant provide a response within a reasonable time, including an assessment of the expected impact of the change. And depending on the magnitude of the change, the assessment should include detailed reasons for the impact. The contract should identify the types of changes that are and are not chargeable. So for instance, there might be a distinction between new requirements that are being added to the project, new scope, as compared to refinements of requirements or existing scope. Likewise, if there are new customizations that are needed, the process may look at what are the reasons for the customizations being needed. Was it because of a failure of the consultant to identify gaps or properly scope out the project? That was the consultant's responsibility. Or was it from, as we've discussed, a cultural resistance of users to change their processes? And finally, the contract should provide some default pricing parameters for scope changes, such as things like adding or removing interfaces or reports, so that if the parties can't agree on pricing, there's at least a path to resolve that potential dispute.
Thank you, Paul. It doesn't seem like we have any other questions that have come through. So that wraps up today's program, and on behalf of Mayor Brown and my colleagues, thank you for your time. I hope you found this program useful, and please be on the lookout for future invitations to our Business and Technology Sourcing webinar series. Some final housekeeping items for today's participants. A recording and a link to the materials for this program will be distributed by email in the next day or two. And for those applying for CLE credit, please note that the certificates of attendance will be distributed within 30 days of this program date. To submit a topic idea for future programs, please email us at bts@mayorbrown.com. Thank you all again, and I will turn over the call to the operator for the closing formalities.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.